they'll,
Charles, can you let me know if the live stream comes up?
Yeah, I just logged onto that page now, so I will save it. Oh, yeah, it looks like it's no. There it is. Good.
Okay. Waiting. I'll let people in. Hi, everyone. This is Lindsay. We're just going to wait a few minutes for everyone to join the call before we begin.
Hi, Ron. Haven't seen you in a while. It's Karen.
Hey, Karen. How you doing? It's been a while.
Yeah, doing good. Hope you are too.
See, I did have you guys on video, and no, I don't.
Well, we can see you.
Maybe it's on Lindsay's end. I have the audio, but I no longer have the video.
Can you see my shared screen, Ron?
All I have is connect with us, and then the different little icons, Facebook, Twitter, and all those things. I don't have anything that says share.
There should be a slide that's meeting logistics, and that's where we are.
This is Ernest. Why is my camera not on? I have it on over here.
Hey, welcome, Karen.
Ernest, you can turn your video on. There's a stop video button or a start video button. You can just click that and it will turn your video on.
It's at the bottom of the screen to the left on mine anyway.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
That didn't hurt too bad.
Good.
Dr. Gerard, I like your look.
It looks like most everyone has been able to join the meeting. So I'll kick it over to our co-chairs to start us off.
Okay, well, I am Karen Gotro, one of the co-chairs, and what I'll do is ask that the meeting of the Committee of the Climate Task Force, the Agriculture, Forestry, Conservation, and Waste Sector Committee, to be specific, be called to order. And I just want to say that this meeting has been certified to be held virtually. So with that, I'll ask my co-chair Joey to go over the meeting logistics.
Morning, everybody. This is Joey Bro, and you can see meeting logistics on the slide on the screen there. And pretty self-explanatory. It's being recorded and live streamed on the internet via YouTube, I believe. Lindsay could correct me there if I'm wrong. Please leave your camera on, and here I am without one, but that's just the nature of my beat. Later on, or at least anytime it's convenient, please include your affiliation in your Zoom name so that we can know who you are and who you represent, but I think most of us know each other. Keep yourself on mute when not speaking, use the chat box, but vocalize as much as possible when you have good, valuable ideas relevant to the group. Please hold your questions to the end of each agenda item, and Please be cautious and mindful about meeting disruptions. Nobody can throw you out, but Lindsay might be able to disconnect you, but I don't think we're going to have that problem here today. And another thing is regarding the likelihood or not of being Zoom bombed. It's never happened before, but I hear being Zoom bombed is like having an ingrown toenail. You may never have experienced before, but you'll know when it happens. And if it does, we'll just shut this down and reconvene later. That's all I have for meeting logistics.
Great, thanks. Lindsay, do you want to call the roll to see if we have a quorum?
Yes, and I'll just note that we are accepting public comments before and during the live stream of this meeting. So you can contact the climate@la.gov email. And in the subject line, if you could just include reference to this committee, the Agriculture, Forestry, Conservation, and Waste Committee, and the agenda item that you'd like to address. Then we'll read it into the record at the end of the meeting.
Great, thank you, Lindsay.
So, on to our roll call. First, Joey Bro.
Here.
Karen Gautreaux.
Here.
Greg Grandy.
Here.
Yolanda Righteous.
Here.
Naveen Adesamili.
Here.
Ernest Gurard. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Here.
Buck Vanderstein. Robbie Toombs.
Here.
Justin Kozak.
Here.
Ron Harrell.
Here.
Kyla Shanae.
Here.
David Daigle. Fran Harvey.
Here.
John Petrie.
Here.
Michael Lindsay.
Here.
That's all, members. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Lindsay. And a few slides down in the main presentation, I don't see it here, but we'll need to approve, there we go, our meeting agenda for the day. It's pretty straightforward, and I don't know that there's anything beneficial that we can include to what we have there. I would like a motion for one of the committee to approve the agenda.
This is Karen. I'll make the motion.
Thank you. Can I have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Opposed? All right, Lindsay, we have our approval.
Okay, well then I'd like to move on to agenda item number 4, welcoming and opening remarks. And welcome again, everyone, to the first meeting of our Agriculture, Forestry, Conservation, and Waste Sector Committee of the Climate Initiatives Task Force. And I'm very honored to be sharing this committee with, co-chairing it with Joey Bro, who you just heard from. And I'm very thankful to have had the opportunity to work with for many years. The Nature Conservancy, who I work for, recognizes that climate change is an existential threat to people and nature, and mitigating climate change impacts is a priority for our organization, and it is a personal priority for me. I've worked in Louisiana coastal land loss issues for many years and have watched as climate change has increasingly been integrated into our plans for our coast and our future. We know it's a problem that we must do our part in addressing, both to ensure we have a sustainable coast and a thriving economy in the future in our state. And I want to commend Governor Edwards for establishing this task force with very ambitious goals, and it will require the input and support of numerous sectors, which I think is reflected in the composition of the task force, our sector committees, and advisory groups. I also want to thank his staff for doing the groundwork and developing a process for this important work to move forward. I'm also very grateful for the members who have agreed to serve on this committee. We'll have a lot of work to do in a compressed time frame, but based on the expertise represented on this group, I'm confident that we'll get it done. And I look forward to learning more about the members during introductions later in the meeting, and look forward to learning from them during the course of our discussions. As Lindsay mentioned, there is an opportunity for public input, which is very important to us. That's going to be, that opportunity is going to be during specific points in the task force process and committee meetings. And I know that public input is challenging during normal times, much more so during a pandemic. But if there is a suggestion from the members or from the public about how we can make it more effective, I know that the committee and staff members will be willing to consider them. I also know the staff has some constraints in terms of legal requirements and technological capabilities, I guess. But again, look forward to our work. It is very important, and I look forward to fulfilling the mandates of the task force in a couple of, well, not even a couple of years, in a fairly short amount of time, but again, very important work. With that, Joey, would you like to say something?
Sure. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Joey Brew. I've been with the Department of Ag and Forestry, Office of Soil and Water Conservation for more years than I can probably count, really long time, and I've had the great opportunity to work with most of you here, and most of the work that I've done in my time here with the department, the Office of Soil and Water Conservation, has been through the local soil and water conservation districts and in strong partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service and the LSU Ag Center, Farm Bureau, and lots of others. And there's a lot of good work that we're doing along these lines, and I'm not surprised, I guess I a little bit was, that it came out so strongly the way that it did from the governor's office. But again, it's the direction that I think we all agree we need to be looking, and we've all been aware, those of us in the ag, conservation, forestry, and waste sectors, that we're doing things relevant to this initiative. How well they've all been quantified, I don't know. We have pretty good handles on a lot of what we've done, especially since the advent of the '96 Farm Bill, where EQIP rolled out and all the practices that became available to private landowners there, and the evolutions that have taken place in the history of that program. So there's a lot of good things that we're doing. Again, we may just need to look harder at quantifying, understanding what we're doing, accelerating some of the benefits that we're attaining there, and maybe looking at things in a different light. In the ag realm, we've always considered our potential for carbon sinks, carbon sequestration, and it's real, it's there, and we know we're getting it done, and we've tried to make approaches to this end before when there were what seemed to be opportunities at a carbon market. But here, and it's going to come up later, it may already have, but looking at ag, forestry, conservation, and waste management's role in emissions reductions, looking at our involvement through that lens may be a little different. And a lot of the things that we see there are going to be the same as we've regarded through sequestration, but again, a regard for this initiative via emissions reductions in the name of ag, forestry, conservation, and waste is where our focus, as we're handed, needs to be, and it's something that I think we can do and be very successful at. That's all I have, Karen. Oh, let me see here.
Thank you, Joey. Sorry.
Okay. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go to Lindsay, and she's going to give us the grand overview of the objectives here and the structure and process of the Climate Change Task Force Initiative. Lindsay, could you kick that off for us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen and Joey, for a great introduction and welcoming remarks to everyone. And good morning, all of our members and the public, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Lindsay Cooper. I work in the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, and our team, so myself alongside Charles Sutcliffe and Harry Vorhoff, will be staffing the Climate Task Force and the different sector-based committees and the advisory groups as well. And so today, we'll start talking through some of the problem statement of why we're here in the Governor's executive order that has brought us together. Then we'll dive into the Climate Task Force and zoom into our committee. What is our charge and our scope? And at that point, we'll have a discussion around those components, but also have a few moments for everyone to introduce themselves. So even though we're not in person, we can still get to know the other members of the committee. And then I'll jump back into a brief presentation on the planning process, and then we'll discuss the objectives for this group before we finish off with some next steps and public comment. So let's first start by defining the problem. So we're brought together by an executive order of the governor that establishes the charge and vision that Louisiana can and will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to limit the impacts of climate change. And the vision offered in the executive order really acknowledges head-on the two realities that we have in Louisiana. First, that we're extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we must do our part to mitigate those impacts and reduce our emissions. But secondly, as the governor mentions, we have a leadership role that we're dependent upon in industry for our economy. So learning to balance those two realities that we live in is a key component of this effort that we are starting. So in this executive order, the governor set the goal for what emission reduction would look like in Louisiana. So this effort, the Climate Task Force as a whole, is focused strictly on the mitigation and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In the state, we have other adaptation and resilience initiatives. And we know that looking at emissions themselves is a big enough task for Louisiana. So that's where we'll have our focus in this effort. And it's really important to have goals set from the beginning of this effort so we know exactly what we're working towards. So these goals, you might have seen them from other states and other countries around the world, but it's a short-term goal of 26 to 28% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2025. There's an interim goal of a 40 to 50% reduction by 2030. And then that final goal is net carbon neutrality by 2050. So the work of the task force, the committees, the advisory groups will all be to set Louisiana on a trajectory to meet our climate emission goals. And everything we do in these groups is intended to set us on a path that helps reach these goals. So that really sets a scope for us. So why did we choose these goals? Simply put, we need to reverse the impacts of climate change in Louisiana by reducing emissions. So human activities are responsible already for 1 degree warming of Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And trends show that we will warm at least 1.5 degrees, more likely 2 degrees in the next 50 years. So Louisiana needs to do our part to reduce emissions, not only to reduce climate-related risk to our health, our economy, our livelihoods, but also to lower the needs of adaptation to climate change. So what does it look like for Louisiana to do our part? In this graph, you can see how Louisiana compares to other states around the nation. We rank 8th in total emissions, and New York is right behind us, which just shows the greatness of our emissions per capita compared to other states like New York. So if we dive a little bit deeper into that point and look at emissions per GDP and emissions per capita across the states, Louisiana ranks 4th in emissions per GDP and 5th in emissions per capita. And this really highlights the need to recognize that Louisiana's emissions are different from other states. So we can acknowledge our impact, but also need to understand that the nation really relies on the energy that Louisiana produces, and our jobs and economy also rely on that as well. So it's learning to balance that recognition that Louisiana looks a little bit different than other states do. So what is the impact of these higher emissions in Louisiana? The National Climate Assessment did a wonderful review in their 4th assessment on the Southeast. And so as they outlined, we have increasing vector-borne diseases and heat, which, relevant to our committee, it makes it harder for farmers to work outside during the day, and it makes it riskier as well for their health in doing so. And secondly, as we're all very familiar with, climate change increases flood risk in coastal regions, which might shift where it's suitable to farm, and it might just drown crops altogether if we have a hurricane or extreme flooding. And as we are also all aware of, flooding requires more state tax dollars to repair damages and also federal dollars to recover from storms. So a few more impacts that the climate assessment highlights is that climate change will cause drought and warming winter temperatures and extreme rainfall. And these patterns not only overpower our stormwater infrastructure and drainage capabilities, but they also impact the seasonality of agriculture, and they cost farmers and the government a lot of money and potentially raise prices in products for consumers as well. And then also to note in this graphic below and in that fourth point that changes in heat will affect the ability to work outdoors. And as you can see in this graphic, this is something Louisiana is already seeing and will continue to see. So what does this mean in Louisiana? Why does this matter to us? We can see how these are all interconnected systems. The increasing heat, the warming temperatures, the increased flooding that we're experiencing, they're all interconnected and have cascading impacts. And so it's affecting us at an increasing rate, and we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. And so I think this all really shows that we can't adequately minimize or adapt to the impacts of climate change unless we address the root cause, which is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So there's only so much adaptation that we can do until we need to also mitigate. So our state faces these extreme challenges, but how are we addressing that? So setting climate emission targets is a great start for us, but it's not enough on its own. We recognize that these are lofty goals, but very attainable for Louisiana if we have a path to meet them. And so for this reason, the governor, when he set those goals, he also established the Climate Initiative Task Force through that same executive order. So they're tasked just to do this, to help meet those targets. And as a reminder, we've addressed this, but this is the vision that we'll be operating under for this effort. To look at our task force as a whole, so this is composed of 23 members from state and local government, from nonprofits, environmental groups, industry, community groups, and other representatives. And this is the overall driving body of this climate initiative. So we held the first meeting of the Climate Task Force in early November, and we outlined these 5 values that are really important to those discussions, knowing that we're bringing together a very broad group of people. And I think it's important to carry these 5 values into our committee as well, since people are coming from very different perspectives. It's important that we listen to and that we respect the opinions of others with integrity, that we maintain transparency in our effort through clearly voicing our objectives and our perspectives to the group in a manner that includes others and facilitates a public process. And we'll do all of this through a science-based and consensus-driven public process. But we know that we can't just rely on a 23-member task force to reduce all of Louisiana's emissions. So we've set up these subgroups, 10 subgroups, underneath the task force to help the task force meet these goals and visions set forth by the governor. So as you can see in those green boxes, we've outlined 4 different areas of expertise that we see as necessary across all conversations. We want all of our conversations to be grounded in scientifically accurate data, in equitable decisions that we're not increasing disproportionate impacts of climate change, but we're working to mitigate that. And that we're also creating financially feasible solutions that account for the economy and where we want to see the economy. And lastly, law and policy. It's important that we create solutions that are grounded in practicality and law and policy. And so then below those advisory groups in the blue boxes, you can see the 6 sector-based committees. And these committees will each have their own focus on a major emission sector in Louisiana. It's really dividing out and helping these different groups have a narrow scope on what their focus is. So discussing a bit of the roles here, the sector committees, which our group is one of, it has two primary missions, and one of those is to scope the emission sources and sinks in this sector. And the second, as we move into 2021, will be developing and evaluating emission reduction strategies. And as I mentioned on the prior slide, the advisory groups will interact with those committees to ensure that those four main tenets are considered through all of the strategies. And advisory groups will interact with committees in the task force also through providing advice upon request and working to ground our effort in those four areas. And lastly, the task force will steer the overall direction of this climate initiative. They'll also develop and approve the interim and final reports that this committee comes up with. And to note on this slide also, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities will be functioning to staff and direct and help plan all of these different groups. We'll also be we are the chair of the Climate Task Force overall. And we're working alongside the Water Institute of the Gulf to develop a very thorough and accurate planning process throughout. So we have some deliverables that we're working towards. As outlined in the executive order, we have an interim report and a final report that will be produced by the task force. And sandwiched in between there's a greenhouse gas inventory update. So some of you might know that our most recent state inventory was done in 2010, but it has 2005 data. And that's great for our baseline because we're reducing emissions from that 2005 baseline. But we also need to know where our emissions stand now. So we're working alongside other state agencies to commission this update from the LSU Center for Energy Studies. And we anticipate deliverables for the middle of 2021, which will be very helpful to inform some of the strategies and emission reduction that we reach with our groups. To dive a little bit deeper into the process and timeline, I won't go through each step that's listed on this slide. There's obviously a lot that we have to get done before the final strategy. But I wanted to show that though this is a short timeline to the final report in just 14 months, we do have a process in place to meet these near-term deliverables and remain grounded but not constrained by the process. And so to note, once we get into the new year in 2021, alongside those deliverables that are highlighted in blue, we'll also have a public solicitation of emission reduction strategies in each of the major emission sectors in all 6 of our groups. And we really want the public and members of our committees to submit their solutions to our different groups. And that will be the main task for the spring and summer, is going through those public and member FinTen proposals and determining what strategies we can move forward with. And that will really form the basis of the final climate strategy that will be developed next year. So let's look at the interim report, since that is coming up very soon. This will focus on really defining the problem of climate change in Louisiana and the different ways that it affects Louisiana. The interim report will also outline the mission, the vision, the process, and the work plan for this climate initiative. And as you can tell in part 3, the committees and advisory groups will play an important role even in this interim report. Having you guys scope your sectors, establish your objectives, and talk through opportunities and challenges, and possibly identifying gaps as well in the sector that we need to recognize. So that will all go into the interim report. And I'd like to note that this timeline is short, so it will require the investment of all committee members, and it will require us to move quickly throughout this process. So that was a lot of structure, but what does that mean for this group? So the charge that we've given to all the committees is primarily to create those emission sector-specific strategies on reaching our emission reduction goals. For the Agriculture, Forestry, Conservation, and Waste Committee, the charge could look something like this: examining emission reduction measures in agriculture and forestry practices, examining conservation measures to promote and maintain natural carbon sinks and blue carbon opportunities, and also examining waste management. But this is very broad. We know that in this sector, there's a lot to be explored. And so I'll say that this is our starting point, and as we continue to interact in this committee and consider your feedback, we'll build out this one-line definition of what our charge is. And I'll note this here, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into emissions later on. But knowing that that's a narrow scope, these are some of the identified sources from that 2010 inventory that are inside of the committee scope. And again, I'll say this is not comprehensive of all that needs to be covered, but what was outlined in that state inventory. So we'll be building off of this list as we move forward. And so with that, I'd like to take any questions on the overall task force vision and the overview, and more specifically in the committee.
So Lindsay, I know we'll be working on the charge, but should we revisit that slide and see if there are any comments and questions about any of the presentation? But I would like to get a feel for how the committee feels about that charge.
That's a great idea.
Question.
Lindsay, this is Naveen. I think it's a question to the chair and the co-chairs, I guess. Don't you think the timeline is too tight, guys, even for the interim report, January 2021? That's too tight of a timeline to even come up with any numbers, literature review, even putting together all the material. Thoughts?
I think we're going to do foundational work, even being able to examine what's going on right now, maybe some potentials. I agree, and I don't think, I think this is a starting point that will be used as a foundation for our discussions. So Lindsay, I'd appreciate what you would have to say about that.
I agree with Karen on that, and Naveen, I appreciate your concern on that. But as we're working towards this interim report, as Karen mentioned, this is really establishing the direction that we're going in and what the process is that we'll use throughout the next year as we're developing these emission reduction strategies. And even this final report as a whole, it will just serve as a launching point for Louisiana in reaching these emissions. We know that this is a very long-term strategy, and so we have to start somewhere.
That's Mike Lindsay. Noted in the greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, the first goal was set for 2025 to reduce to 26 to 28% of the 2005 levels. Do we have a reference of where we think we are now relative to 2005 and say 2020?
We will be getting that update. I wouldn't want to speak from an unintelligible point of view, but we'll be getting inventory in 2021.
So let's see, we're having some technical difficulties with your audio. Maybe it's everything because I have feedback now. I guess if everybody can put themselves on mute unless they're talking, that sometimes helps. Yes, and that's my understanding, that the greenhouse gas inventory is going to give us just that, where we are right now. So as we continue our discussions, we'll have that as a reference. And that, again, as Lindsay mentioned, that's in mid-2021.
Okay, thank you.
As Karen mentioned, are there any comments on this charge, any need to expand this or refine this charge right now?
Does this work for everyone as a starting point? as a charge? Anybody have any concerns about it? And I think as we talk, if we need to refine that, that's a possibility, right, Lindsay? But in general, this gets us started off.
Absolutely.
This is Robbie. I don't have a problem with the charge. I would like to see a copy of the presentation so I could look through it better.
Absolutely, Robbie. I'll send that out to everyone afterwards, after the meeting. And I can also send a copy of the 2010 greenhouse gas inventory that will help identify that baseline that we're working from.
Yeah, and another point related to that, you know, this was done in 2010, as Lindsay mentioned, 2005 information. If there are areas that you think have emerged or should be considered that weren't considered in the greenhouse gas inventory, I think that would be a good observation to offer early on in the process. So please do take the time to look at this section, and if you have any feedback, let us know.
Lindsay, Ron Harrell, when you send out that information, could you also include the membership of this committee, who they represent, and contact information?
Absolutely.
Karen, this is Naveen. Have a question. I mean, did you have a chance when the 2010 report came out? I mean, what was the framework behind those greenhouse gas emissions? Or anyone here on the committee had a chance to look through it?
Naveen, we'll dive into the emissions inventory a little bit later on as we get into our process. And that might help frame it for you a little bit, and I'll also send that to you, and we can talk through some of the framing if that would be helpful.
And this is Charles, also with Governor's staff. I would just say too that we were planning on the next meeting of the task force to invite David Dismukes from LSU Center for Energy Studies, who kind of was the lead author, to come in and walk everybody through the process, and then also how he's going to be approaching the update. So that'll be coming at our next larger task force meeting.
Thanks, Charles. So if there are no further questions, we'll move into our next agenda item 6, and have some time for introductions. So I'll start with our co-chairs in this, and then just walk through our roll call name by name. And it would be great if everyone could give just a 1 or 2 minute introduction with their name and occupation and the expertise that brings them to this group. So Joey, we'll kick it off with you.
Okay, Joey Burrow here, Department of Ag and Forestry, Office of Soil and Water Conservation. Hey, I've jumped the gun a bit on intro earlier, but I've worked with a lot of your agencies, John, Pete, and Mike Lindsay with NRCS. I've worked with them, I think, since my first day with this agency way back. DEQ, Yolanda, solid waste folks there. We've been working for years, since the early to mid-90s, through opportunities created through DEQ solid waste to work with agricultural producers and processors to manage ag solid waste. Karen, in a number of capacities that she's worked in over the years, and Melissa and her group more recently in watershed management, nutrient reduction initiatives, and of course Naveen in the LSU Ag Center. Lots of great partnerships, and of course Ron Harrell and Farm Bureau, and look forward to working with all of you and everyone else through this current initiative. That's all I've got, Lindsay.
Thanks, Joey. Karen?
I'm Karen Gautreaux, the Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy in Louisiana. And before I worked with TNC, I'm now on year 13, I can't believe it. I worked for many years with the state of Louisiana, and like Joey, with many of you on the committee, in a few administrations, generally covering natural resource and environmental policy issues, and very active in the coastal program throughout my time there, and continuing that with Nature Conservancy. And in terms of this committee's activities, TNC, as mentioned, is very supportive of addressing climate change. It's one of our priorities. And so we work at the national level with private and public organizations, corporate CEOs to look at climate policy that can move us into the future, and especially from the corporate perspective. On the ground, we help work with farmers, landowners, agencies. We're very interested in advancing what we call natural climate solutions. And these are projects or programs that help us use natural infrastructure to achieve carbon sequestration. An example many of you are familiar with and have expertise in is the opportunity for forest carbon sequestration, afforestation, reforestation, better management. Another example is building vertical reefs, oyster reefs on the coast, which have the capacity to keep up with sea level rise. They sequester carbon, provide baby oysters, improve water quality. So many things that offer multiple benefits as a way to achieve your goals. So we think it has an absolute role in climate mitigation and adaptation. And we're really excited about this because we're bringing, our national office is excited to provide policy and science, any resources they can provide. I have state offices calling to share what they're doing and look forward to learning from us. And in our office in Baton Rouge, we have coastal scientists, forest scientists, wetland scientists who I can call on as we look at specific issues. So we're very happy to be participating on this, and I really look forward to learning from all of you. So thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Greg Grandy.
Good afternoon. My name is Greg Grandy. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. I've worked in the coastal conservation arena in Louisiana for going on 25 plus years now. It's an absolute honor and a privilege to serve in the role of leadership at CPRA right now and work with some extraordinarily talented folks, both at our agency and also all the other agencies and consultants and academia and NGOs around the state. Our agency, we were created in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina when Governor Blanco formed us and charged us with creating a master plan to protect our coastal communities and also restore our ecosystems. And a lot of that work prior to that time was done in separate state agencies that were in their own silos, and she more or less brought us together. Karen sort of stole a little bit of my thunder. CPRA, the opportunity to sequester carbon through ecosystem restoration projects is something that really excites us. I'm sorry, someone was trying to call in, and we I appreciate the opportunity to serve on this committee. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. Yolanda Righteous.
Yolanda, you're on mute still. Can't hear.
Here we go. Hi, my name is Yolanda Righteous. I'm the Waste Permits Administrator for waste permitting here at the Louisiana DEQ. We're part of the Office of Environmental Services. This division handles all of the waste permitting, hazardous waste, solid waste permitting, as well as the tire program. And so I've worked, as Joey mentioned, I've worked very closely with Joey, with the Department of Ag, trying to find beneficial reuses for primarily wood waste type materials. One huge initiative that we are actively engaged in with EPA is the coal combustion residual rules and regulations. We're in the process of having a sort of separate permitting program that deals with the facilities that generate those coal combustion residuals. So I'm pretty sure that's going to be a large part of the discussion of this committee moving forward. Appreciate the opportunity to work with everyone and getting to know folks that I haven't had an opportunity to work with in the past. So thank you.
Thank you, Yolanda. Naveen, out of Simile.
Hello, guys. I'm an extension economist with the LSU Ag Center. Prior to joining LSU, I worked for NRDC for a couple of years. But after joining LSU, I worked with NRCS very closely and LDF through their soil water conservation districts. And my primary focus is natural resource economics, expanding conservation within the working lands, and then use that data to analyze some of the policies that are currently in place. And then I've learned quite a bit from Dr. Girard here. I've served under his leadership in the Master Farmer Program, and I got to know a lot of folks, John, Melissa here, and worked very closely with Joey as well. And it's been a wonderful journey. But I'm happy to be here, happy to contribute in any way I can, and looking forward to the meetings. All right, guys.
Thank you, Naveen. Ernest Girard.
You muted, Doc.
I'm a landowner, a retired farmer with 39 years of farming experience. I also have the first certification for Louisiana Master Farmer Program in the state of Louisiana. And I have served as the coordinator of that program for approximately 15 years and retired from the program. I've been active at the local level with 36 to maybe 37 years of serving on the Soil and Water Conservation District in Vermilion. Most of that time as chair or vice chair. I've continued to work at the state level with the Louisiana Association of Conservation Districts and served as the chair of that organization for a number of years. I served at the national level with the National Association of Conservation Districts on the national board. And currently I serve on the national board of the Soil and Water Conservation Districts Presidents Association, representing the states of Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Most of my work and my interest is in soil and water conservation and working with the sustainability of farmers by the use of NRCS's accepted conservation practices to protect all the natural resources. I'm very excited about serving on this task force, especially from the fact that I represent landowners and the organizations that work with landowners to enable most of the concerns that we are going to discuss with the climatic change. Thanks.
Thank you, Ernest. Robbie Toombs.
Yes, I'm Robbie Toombs. I'm the region manager for Resource Management Service. In Louisiana, we manage about 240,000 acres of timberland, primarily in LaSalle, Caldwell, and Catahoula parishes. RMS is a TIMO, which is a Timberland Investment Management Organization. In other words, we manage timberland for institutional clients, primarily like pension funds. Many of our clients are international, and of course they have a financial component, but they also have a strong desire to make sure we're managing it environmentally competent manner. We adhere to Sustainable Forestry Initiative practices and third-party audited, and try to follow ESG, environmental, societal, and governance guidelines. I'm a forester. My first day full-time in the woods was January of 1979, so I've done it a day or two. and I pretty much worked in all aspects of Southern forest management. I am on the board of directors with Mississippi Forestry Association, and I'm close friends with Keith Hickley, which I think is probably one of the reasons I'm on here. The Nature Conservancy, Keith and I and Lisa Creasman worked together on a project back in the 80s and early 90s that consummated in 2000, that created the Cat Island National Wildlife Management Area, just west of St. Francisville. At the time, the company I worked for owned the land, and we were able to work with TNC to get it into the federal ownership. With that, thank you, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you, Robbie. Justin Kozak.
Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Kozak. I'm a project manager at the Center for Planning Excellence, and we're a nonprofit planning organization in Baton Rouge. We focus on incorporating best practices and forward-looking strategies into planning efforts just about at every scale throughout the state. Much of our work focuses on community adaptation and resilience measures as of late. I'm also involved in Louisiana Watershed Initiative, working with state agencies to work towards alignment, consistency, uptake of best practices for flood risk and floodplain management. Some of my other academic and professional work includes ecosystem services valuation work, both in wetland environments and under different land use scenarios in agricultural landscapes. We looked at carbon sequestration, reduced erosion and sedimentation, nutrient cycling on some of that work, and other relevant work to, I guess, this task force would be looking at environmental flows in managed river systems to maximize ecosystem benefits in swamplands and flooded forests and bottomland hardwoods.
Thanks, Justin. Ron Harrell.
Thank you, Lindsay. My name is Ron Harrell. I am the managing director of the commodity division within the Louisiana Farm Bureau Federation. Farm Bureau is a general farm and ranch membership organization representing Louisiana agriculture. I've personally been involved in agriculture my entire life, primarily on the beef cattle production side of it, but my responsibilities with LFBF have exposed me to just about every commodity that we produce, and that is a very wide umbrella when you look at how diverse the ag industry is in our state. I also am looking forward to working on this committee and to see what we can't do to address this issue and what kind of recommendations and plan we come up with.
Thank you, Ron. Kyla Shanae.
Yes, hi everyone. So I'm the Director of Sustainability for DRAX US Operations. DRAX is the largest renewable power generator in the UK, and we have 3 wood pellet plants in the southern US, 2 in Louisiana and 1 in Mississippi, as well as our port facility in Baton Rouge. So I oversee the sustainability program and our certifications for the 3 plants, and then I also support verification of our other North American pellet suppliers. And I have been in the forest industry for a little over 20 years. My background is in both wildlife management and forestry. So after a start in wildlife consulting, I moved into the forestry side of things. I worked for the pulp and paper industry in the mountains of Virginia. I worked for large corporate forest landowners, Plum Creek and Weyerhaeuser. And then I joined DRAX in 2017. So I'm really excited about this committee and also getting to know all these fantastic committee members. So thank you.
Thanks, Kyla. Fran Harvey.
Hi, thank you. I'm Fran Harvey. I have a background from Department of Environmental Quality in air quality, and through that effort, I've worked a lot on ozone and became particularly interested in the contribution of biogenics and gravitated toward the use of GIS to map air quality, and worked in particular on urban heat island and showing the effects of biogenics contribution to the urban heat island effect, and with some modeling. And so have spent really a career now in GIS and remote sensing imagery. So after leaving Department of Environmental Quality, ended up doing about 5 years in disaster response and recovery from Katrina to BP oil spill. So that was quite a fascinating experience in the application of GIS and remote sensing. Since then, I now have a private, for-profit and non-for-profit consulting businesses in GIS and remote sensing. The nonprofit is actually teaching high school students to earn an industry-based certification in GIS so that they can earn gainful employment right out of high school, so that they can pay to go to college or become gainfully employed. So that's what we're passionate about. But the main thing that I'm excited about in being involved with this is still the idea of using GIS and remote sensing to demonstrate carbon sequestration and ultimately allowing data-driven decisions to be made based on the data that you can arrive at through the use of GIS and remote sensing. So really looking forward to being on this committee and working with everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fran. John Petrie.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you. Lindsay, I actually pronounced Pete, but I answer to Petrie because it's spelled that way. I think it's a French pronunciation. I'm definitely of French descent, born and raised in Ville Platte. Went to McNeese, got a bachelor's in wildlife management and a master's in environmental science. Been working for NRCS for 30 years now, even when it was USDA Soil Conservation Service. My job title is State Resource Conservationist, and that simply means I supervise the non-soil and non-engineering technical specialists. So we have a group at our state office in Alexandria, biologists, agronomists, foresters, cultural resource specialists that I supervise, and then also our plant materials center in Galliano, who focuses on the main mission is coastal restoration, plant development. But as a whole, the agency, and I'm sure y'all are probably aware of this, we were born out of the Dust Bowl, and we are an agency of USDA, but we serve the private landowner, the private ag producer, be it a commodity producer, livestock producer, or non-industrial private forester. And we help them address resource concerns. So any problems associated with soil, water, air, plants, animals, and certainly greenhouse emissions falls under that category. And in order to do that, we utilize technical expertise in planning, and we have 44 field offices located throughout Louisiana to service the 64 parishes, with planners located in each of those offices. We're currently undergoing a restructuring. We have two areas. North Louisiana is known as Area 1, South Louisiana Area 2, and we have 13 resource units, clusters of field offices within those two areas where our planners are housed. And in addition to our technical ability or our technical assistance that we have at the local level, we also administer Farm Bill programs like the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Wetland Reserve Easement, and these apply to both working lands and taking land, retiring land from agriculture, like the Wetland Reserve Easement lands, probably that should not have been put into production agriculture, but now can be utilized to some extent as to produce forest products. And we lead the nation, by the way, in the Wetland Reserve easement with a little over 300,000 acres, mostly under perpetual easement. But certainly have a lot of financial and technical benefits for the private ag producer in Louisiana and across the nation. So that's kind of a quick overview of our expertise at the agency level. And as with everyone has said, it's an honor to serve on the committee, and hopefully we can provide some sound assistance. Thank you.
John. And lastly, Michael Lindsay.
Yes, hello. Echo what John and several others have said. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this committee. I think it's extremely important. I've been with USDA NRCS for about 17 years as a soil scientist, state soil scientist for about the last 7 years. Much of my job is working with, many of you are familiar with web soil survey and the soil mapping that USDA NRCS does. Beyond that, one of our major functions that we work on in the state and some of the staff that I supervise goes back to soil health initiatives and trying to implement or work with private landowners to implement soil health management systems. And that really boils back to one of the main issues there is carbon sequestration through by any number of means. Minimizing erosion, keeping the soil on the land and out of the stream, nutrient loss, keep her on the ground year round, something growing, pumping carbon into the ground, feeding the soil microbes, but going back to building that soil health, which is a direct link to reducing greenhouse emissions and any number of other sidebar issues. So I'm kind of the lead contact for NRCS for soil health initiatives. Also on the liaison to the USDA Climate Hub for USDA in Louisiana. A lot of good, valuable climate information comes out of that shop. Some of it, much of it related to our end of the world. So I look forward to working with the group and going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And co-chairs, that is all of our members.
Great. Well, I have worked with several of you before and knew we could count on you for your expertise, but I am just really amazed and very grateful for the expertise that's represented in this committee. Thank all of you. And it gives me a lot of confidence. Not that I didn't think we could do it, but I think we're very well suited to fulfill our charge. So, Joey, did you want to say anything?
No, that was good. I think we're ready to move on.
Great. Lindsay?
Let's move on now to agenda item number 7. We'll jump back into a bit of presentation, and that will lead us to our next discussion on our committee's objectives. So I wanted to talk to you guys about the process that we'll be using throughout this effort that all of our groups and the task force as well will be using. And this process is called structured decision making. So we've defined the deliverables and the timelines, but now it's time to think about how we get there. So we'll use this process in ultimately developing that climate strategy and in those emission reduction strategies. So a little bit on structured decision making, also known as SDM. This is not just a process for the sake of having a process, but the point is that because these are very quick timelines, we want to move forward in an objective, transparent, and structured way. And SDM will allow us the transparency and the structure to do just that. It will help us first articulate our objectives, including our emissions targets, but also other economic and societal objectives that we have. And then secondly, this process will help us evaluate our solutions against those objectives and also evaluate the trade-offs between solutions that might come up. So I think one of the great benefits of SDM is that it serves as the convergence of science and policy, which is very important in this conversation where we're developing strategies to reduce emissions, but we must also be very well informed by the science and the data of emissions. So with that, this is the 6-step process that we will be following throughout the decision making. So today we'll start with steps 1 and 2, and that will be necessary to lead us to those steps 3, 4, 5, and 6 as we move throughout the process. So today we'll start by defining the problem and determining our objectives. And then later on that will lead us to identifying alternatives, as I mentioned, through that public solicitation process of emission reduction strategies. And then the committee will evaluate those strategies that are put forth, evaluate the trade-offs between them, and then we'll produce the final climate strategy. So each step we're taking is intentionally building on the last one. And I find that the key benefit of structured decision-making is having structured conversations about these very complex decisions that have to be made. So we're really going to focus on breaking down these complex problems and having conversations that are focused on our values throughout. So to look at the definition of the problem, that first step, we've talked about this a little bit before, but just to frame again, we're identifying the problem that climate change is driving up global temperatures, raising sea levels, and increasing risks that threaten health and safety, quality of life, economic growth, and vital habitat for ecosystems. And this is disproportionately felt by residents of our state with the fewest resources. So taking into consideration also, as I noted, the scientific context. So we're still defining the problem, but on the scientific side. As I mentioned and we discussed briefly before, this data comes from our 2010 greenhouse gas state inventory, and this is 2005 data, which I've noted here. And so the table on the left, it points out a few important things. First, that 84% of our CO2 emissions are from fossil fuel combustion. And these emissions are why we focus so much on carbon dioxide in this effort. But as you can note from the table, moving down from that initial point, is that there are also other greenhouse gases that we will address, including methane and nitrous oxide, sulfur tetrafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and others that are also identified as potent greenhouse gases. And so this pie chart on the right really dives into the 84% of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion. And this isn't directly relevant to our committee, but I think it's important to note the context in which we're working and the impact that fossil fuel combustion does have on our inventory. And then in that blue box is outlined the waste, agriculture, and land use change in forestry emissions, which is what this group will deal with. And as I mentioned earlier, what we're looking at here is not comprehensive of all of our emission sources and sinks that need to be addressed, but this is the starting point on the state side from which we're working. So we'll need the help from all of you guys to identify those other sources as we move forward. So let's first look at the agriculture emissions that the inventory notes. You can see the predominance of agriculture soil emissions, followed by rice cultivation, enteric fermentation, manure management, and a little bit of agricultural residue burning. But if you look at the chart on the right, it shows that the emissions in this sector are pretty minimal compared to some of the others that we saw on the slide prior. So let's break down forestry next, using that same state inventory data. We can also see here that the emission sources are very small, primarily looking at forest fires and urea fertilization, liming agricultural soils. But we also see part of the solution here as well. So I think this committee is unique in the fact that we're not just defining the problem, but we're also defining a piece of the solution, which is these carbon sinks and carbon sequestration. So notable here that the inventory had pulled out is forest carbon flux. And that's the land use change and forest management activities that affect the balance between emissions and uptake of greenhouse gases. So that's outlined here. The inventory also notes on the waste management side, the primary contributor is municipal solid waste landfills, with the primary sink as flaring. But I also noted some of the other sources that were included in the 2010 inventory that are necessary to look at as well. and I'll bring this slide back that we had briefly touched on earlier. The 2010 inventory isn't comprehensive of our scope of emissions, nor is it comprehensive of the carbon sinks and sequestration. So we have a lot to explore in this committee through our coastal work and the coastal master plan, but also through agricultural and forestry lands. So this group will have the opportunity to expand and refine this scope and explore sources and sinks. And I think it's a big benefit that we're working on a new inventory as we're starting these groups, so that we can have input from this group as we are developing those categories for the new inventory for Louisiana. And so that frames our decision context well, so that first step. And so now that we have defined that, we can move into the second step of setting our objectives. And so the context that we just defined should influence how we define objectives of our group. So what do we care about? What is fundamental to our effort? And then how do we get there? What are the different ways in which we can get there? And so these fundamental objectives are a vital step in the SDM process, because it's important to define transparent objectives, because that will guide us later as we evaluate strategies in the process. So we have a primary goal of emission reduction, but there are also objectives that will influence how we decide to reduce emissions. If you remember our vision statement, the governor even mentioned that this is a balance of reducing emissions while limiting the impact on people of climate change and maintaining our position as a leader. So when we look in the context of agriculture, we must consider the cost of innovative best management practices and its impact on farmers and possibly crop production and the price of groceries for consumers. So reducing emissions can't be done without considering the cost, the profitability, the societal benefits, and the equitable outcomes. So this is why we've brought together a group of such broad expertise to help us ensure that all of these aspects are considered and that they remain fundamental to the effort. And so that's what we're after today, is to have a discussion on those objectives. So with all of that said, I'd like to open up to a discussion, starting off with our co-chairs. But as our group, this is a first big step that allows us to talk through our goals without going directly to solutions. So as the process identifies, we will get to solutions, but first we need to have some guardrails and guidelines up as we move forward. And as all of you know, our experiences and our perspectives and our jobs very much influence how we make decisions, whether we voice it or not. And since transparency is such an important component of this public process, then it's important that we now voice these needs and what we care about, so that we can have that transparency as we move forward. So I'll take us out of presentation mode. Oh, there we go. And I'm going to make some notes on the slide as we have this discussion, so people can see the objectives that are being discussed by other members. And for everyone's visibility, we do have people who will be taking notes and helping us distill these fundamental objectives as we move forward from this meeting. So even if I don't write it down on the slide, everything that is mentioned will be included in the discussion. So with that, I'll ask our co-chairs to kick us off. So Karen, in your work at the Nature Conservancy and your background in government and conservation and the extensive work that TNC does in this sector, what are your objectives? What matters to you as we work towards emission reduction?
Karen, you're on mute.
Sorry. So from my perspective, I guess two things. I would like to bring our expertise into this arena to support development of policies that, thank you, help reduce emissions related to the sector. But particularly, my objective is to maximize opportunities to have natural climate solutions as a part of this scenario. So I guess identify those opportunities and try to help implement projects or programs that provide for natural climate solutions, as mentioned earlier in my discussion. And if I need to review that anymore, I'll be glad to, but.
That's great, Karen. So Joey, with your perspective from the state in agriculture and forestry and a lot of the local work that you do with soil and water conservation districts, what do you view as your objectives?
Wow, it's really hard to make it as very succinct, and the more I think about it, it just broadens. You know, I failed to mention earlier in my intro the work that we've done with CPRA, Greg Grandy, his agency, and that agency's predecessor on the coast. And it's big. Those conservation districts, through funding from CPRA, every year plant 38 to 40 linear miles of coastal vegetation every year. Not all successful, but largely is, and a lot's been learned in a database of just a wealth of information that we've really, it's so massive that we've struggled to really make usable. Ideally, we'd have a queryable database of restoration data on the coast that would be so useful to everyone. And all of the technical expertise that's come into the program has come from NRCS. They helped to develop the program back in it's where I got my start in the early mid-90s. And there, from the outer, lower to mid-estuaries, they're working lands. They're products that come from them. They're essential at the same time for carbon sinks and the outermost examples of ecosystem restoration that was mentioned earlier. And you move on inland from that, you start talking residue management and conservation tillage and the kind of things that begin to alleviate the conditions you showed there on your slide related to ag outputs and emissions. Rice was a biggie. And I think it's an often misunderstood one that I think we could shift back to some of what we're looking at regarding ecosystem maintenance on the coast. How do we do that? I don't know, but there's people here who have wonderful ideas. And it comes back to one of the things would be irrigation management. How do we do that? What are the things that are important there? And like you said, Lindsay, what's the cost to the landowner? When it comes to all these things, the offsets for the landowners have to be real and available, and it comes through the Farm Bill, the conservation title of the Farm Bill. It's very important. So, yeah, we got to keep that going. Ecosystem restoration, then we look at ecosystem maintenance and management. And lots of people, especially John Pete and his ecological services team at NRCS and Mike Lindsay and his soils agronomists and specialists there, have mentioned extensively the use of ag processes to develop forms of biomimicry that can help to manage and maintain these ecological systems. And what's been big for me is where ag ends. We start to look at fallow lands that were cropped at one time. What's happening to them vegetatively? And for the most part, we're dealing with invasives there. And I think a lot of people would agree that if in the prairie areas of southwest Louisiana, something similar to what has happened or benefits that were offered through the WRP and the CRP, like John mentioned earlier, could become available there in the name of tallgrass prairie restoration, and come off of that into the gallery forests and riparian areas in those vegetative mosaics that occur where they meet. All those things are important for what we're trying to get done here, and I just don't know that program opportunities are always necessarily available to the landowner, that the landowners always understand them, and that comes to another objective is proper outreach. How are we interfacing with the public? I know that the conservation districts with their partners every year conduct what they call their locally led meetings. LLC means locally led conservation in our world, and it's got to be two-way. Stakeholders to present their concerns are necessary, and to weigh those concerns next to the resource inventory that we get from NRCS. It's important to know what our local starting points are and piece all this together to form a plan and be able to quantify the carbon emissions reductions and sequestration potential in all of that, and know where we're starting from. I hope that wasn't too rambling, but my thoughts are kind of all over the place when it comes to this, and it's what I'm thinking, and I hope I said something that others can piece apart to use in what they'd like to do. That's all I've got.
Thanks, Joey. So would it be fair to say increasing ecosystem restoration, management, and maintenance on the Louisiana coast to increase carbon sequestration would be one of your objectives? And then maybe another is interfacing with the public to weigh their concerns and hear their input on emission reduction strategies.
Yes, that would be.
Joey, would you argue that it's not restricted just to the coast? All of those are statewide issues.
Yes, and I think Lindsay was just going back to the first example that I gave, but yeah, that's
Certainly.
right, Mike.
Sure.
And, you know, one of the things that we get out of our public meetings and that we get in this office now, this time of year, when so much ag burning is going on, there's public concern about that. Not just that the smoke is affecting them, but would that residue be better put back in the soil? And I've got to give them an honest answer, but it's got to be doable for the producer. So, so yeah, and that's our challenge as conservation professionals working with those guys. But yeah, Mike, it's definitely statewide.
Thank you to our co-chairs for those objectives. And now I'd like to open up the floor. I'd love to hear objectives from everyone, and we can continue this discussion and trying to think through what objectives are for this group. I think we have a wide scope here, so it's important we think through it.
Hi, this is Justin. I believe Greg had just mentioned one other thing just in passing, but I want to make sure it's captured. So, I mean, we're undertaking this because we know that there's significant societal benefits to these mitigation efforts, you know, that we'll all benefit from. But where the rubber meets the road, where it's implemented, would be on private landowners or in communities, and there could be costs for them. So I think a fundamental objective is to make sure that these strategies, we identify pathways, whether it's capturing emerging markets, you know, opting into like carbon markets that already exist, to make sure that we can compensate the folks who are, you know, bearing these costs to provide these benefits for everyone. I just wanted to make sure that that got captured from, I believe it was Greg's comment.
Justin, is that a fair objective of what you mentioned, ensuring strategies identify pathways to compensate those who bear the cost of restoration?
Yeah, I wouldn't limit it to restoration. I would have it be land use practices as well. You know, so we're dealing a lot with agricultural lands and forestry lands, and the folks who manage those lands and the techniques and the approaches that they take. You know, there's the change in that process will, and the learning curve and things like that will always be a cost, as well as if agricultural lands are taken out of production and put into, you know, these are marginal lands that are now being used for carbon sequestration. What's the trade-off at the individual level, community level, and how do we measure that against the societal benefit?
Absolutely.
Certainly agree with that, and a little bit broader, workable by those private landowners. I mean, regardless of what we come up with, if it's not acceptable and within their scheme to be workable, especially on their working lands, that it won't go very far.
What I hear y'all saying is, Robbie, basically positive outcomes that encourage people things. As I've racked my brain from a forestry standpoint, trees do a lot of good, but you know, there are some outputs like harvesting where you're using large equipment, things like that. But a positive outcome, and I'm just making it, it would be to encourage contractors to upgrade their fleet. I mean, with low emission equipment, that sort of thing. Yeah, new skidder's $350,000. So, you know, whatever we can do to encourage that transition as much as possible.
Can I ask if that's a consideration across agriculture in addition to forestry? Is that a big challenge, or is it concentrated in the forestry industry in terms of an issue?
Can I comment on that? When in the objectives where we talk about net zero emissions, then we're looking probably, I mean, we're talking from a state level, I mean, an accounting stance, which is at a state level. Now, net zero emissions, let's say, for example, CO2 is a global pollutant. Now, as much as upgrading equipment is useful and is beneficial for the land practices, if you're talking from net zero emissions, that'll then throw us off with the numbers as well. So understanding that is equally important, I guess. But going back again, I want to then reemphasize from an economic standpoint. Most of these equipment are called sunk cost, meaning the farmers have paid it off. So they don't get into their budget at all if you're looking from a profitability standpoint. So when we are doing the societal benefits, it's important to take that into account as well. I mean, because you don't see those numbers in their budget books, then you kind of think that those numbers don't matter, but they do. So rather than saying, is equipment changes necessary, I think, do those changes add to the profitability is more important, I guess. And then do that to the net zero emissions is something that we need to think about as well. I hope I answered the question correctly, or I understood the question correctly, Karen.
So Naveen, would it be accurate from what you mentioned to say that we should determine if lower emission equipment is possible for farmers from an economic standpoint, as well as if it reduces emissions?
From an economic standpoint, it's easy to take into account. Now, what I was saying is from a net zero emission standpoint, those equipment, when they are being produced, there are carbon emissions that are being produced as a result of that. Like, take, for example, as simple as a fertilizer. Fertilizer production has a huge amount of carbon equivalents that are being released as a result of its production. So when we are talking about reducing fertilizer use, or I'll rephrase that, management of fertilizer use on a farm, we're not just talking about fertilizer use with respect to that farm, but from the whole production cycle. It's called the life cycle analysis. But to your question, Lindsay, yes, I mean, all these management activities John mentioned, Joey mentioned about it, all those management activities, and even from a forestry standpoint, and forestry is a very, very unique enterprise because you're looking at huge carbon sink at the same time. I'm working with Michael Blazer on this, Mr. Robbie, and so profitability, it's easy to evaluate, but those practices, what is that level of incentive or a payment that would make a farmer or a landowner change from their existing to a new one? Now, this existing practice can be an old equipment or a different practice, and now we want them to move to a different practice. So yes, I don't want to use the word economic loosely because it does have that fact. I mean, I don't know. Yes, the short answer is yes, but it's. I think we want to be careful saying economically profitable. Sometimes it might not be, but it works in the full life cycle analysis. It is.
Naveen, would it be fair to say that we need to assess what level of incentive and compensation might help farmers change their practices to lower emissions?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
I think we need to be careful that it's not just a matter of incentivizing it, that we have to make sure they understand and are willing to accept the technology. You know, the incentives that we utilize are often, like with the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, they introduce the producer to, say, potentially a mix of cover crops, but it's not long-term support. It's to get them in, you know. So it is important that they understand how it will affect, hopefully benefit their operation and society as a whole. So that education is a huge component, not just saying throwing dollars at them, you know, to support it financially, but educating, you know, and working with them.
Mm-hmm.
Let me interject something here, Ron Harold. I think it would behoove us in this committee, and maybe this should be an objective. There are a number, and this was briefly identified earlier in our conversation, of conservation programs through NRCS, and most producers familiar with these programs. They may not participate in them, but they know they're out there. And up until this point, these programs have been presented more from the standpoint of soil conservation issues with water runoff and water quality. I have not heard a presentation where you're talking about these programs being implemented for greenhouse gas emission control. And I think, you know, before we start reinventing the wheel, that it might behoove us to look at these programs to see with what that program is designed to do, to put this component of greenhouse gas emission control in there to say, well, if this program is designed, and how effective would it be to accomplish this goal, and also you know, the economic incentive for doing this will have a whole lot to do with how well this is received.
Thank you, Ron. That's a great perspective to add, that we would understand a lot of these efforts are interconnected. And as we continue to see the impacts of climate change, we see how there are, as I mentioned earlier, those cascading impacts. And similarly, we need to understand the co-benefits of some of these best management practices.
For example, under the Master Farmer Program, and Ernest, you've been dealing with this for quite some time. I go out there as a farmer, and I implement, you know, NRCS will come and help me put together a conservation plan for my entire farm. And I put these practices in place. Okay, with what I'm doing, you know, how much carbon am I sequestering, you know, and what am I doing to reduce methane or nitrous oxide emissions? And if I have a way of seeing what I'm doing is accomplishing this goal, and then if on down the road, if part of this process is to create some kind of credit program, so I get you know, some kind of recognition, you know, I think you know, that's needed. And me as a producer, I would have I would be more likely to sit down and say, yeah, I need to do this type of thing.
Yes, Ron, they should be voluntary and incentive-based. They should work. They should be science-based. They should be not regulatory. And economics at the farm level is extremely, extremely important. These recommendations should be good for farmers and good for the environment.
Maybe somebody, I agree with you, but maybe somebody should make this question, and I'm getting feedback. Somebody may have their computer or the phone at the same time. How capable are we, and what science is out there to measure exactly what's being emitted and what's being sequestered? Can we do that?
This is Mike. I think with a lot of mic opens, we're going to have feedback. But
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, if everybody's not speaking, can go on mute. That might help.
my thought is, as was mentioned earlier, many of the NRCS conservation practices that people have utilized, some of the direct benefits that were noticed and observed, captured, touted, were the effect on water quality, runoff, et cetera, things like that, things that were visible. And as Dr. Giroir mentioned, those things went back to trying to implement practices, voluntary practices to avoid regulation. And in large part, it has worked. So the most obvious impact was that reduction of sediment runoff, benefits to water quality. Those are the things you could see. A lot of those practices also have the sidebar benefit of that carbon sequestration and any number of things that weren't big visual items at the time, but falling under this context, they are. So, going back to that, I spoke about soil health management systems. Besides the sidebar benefit of the water quality, quantity issues, there is a large component of carbon sequestration, improving soil quality over time. Many producers breaking out of standard modern farming practices. If you start implementing soil health management systems, it may not be an inexpensive proposition because you're expected to reduce tillage, to minimize disturbance of the soil, which really pushes the release of large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere. So that reduction in tillage comes at a cost. Planting those cover crops to keep that soil stabilized and to keep pumping carbon into the ground year round, that comes at a cost. So those initial offsets for some of those programs can help some producers find their way into these new soil health management systems practices. However, over much of the country, once someone has broken that system over to where it is a fully functioning, well-functioning system, they seldom go back to that massive amount of tillage, running heavy equipment. They can reduce equipment. They can reduce number of passes over the field. That reduces CO2 emissions. Across the board, many benefits. I'm not going to say that it doesn't come at some cost, but my thoughts are that once a person gets a system broken over well enough, the system functions much better, much less greenhouse emissions, much more carbon sequestration, and all the other side benefits that go along with that. So my evidence is, going back to the economics, that producers are not going to implement these systems long term once those incentives for those conservation practices that they may get from NRCS or other programs, once those incentives go away, they're not going to continue to do them if they're going broke. So my thought is that once you get a system broken over, you can continue to reap the benefits of that carbon sequestration and the other benefits that go along with it, along with economic benefits, because there's typically less fertilizer use, less fuel consumption, equipment usage, et cetera, across the board. So there have to be economic offsets that are beneficial there, or people all across the country would not continue to do this once those initial incentive payments are gone. So I think that's a bright area for this whole discussion. Thank you.
That's a great point to make, Michael. So in light of all of that, how should that inform us looking at emission reduction strategies? So knowing that producers won't implement after the incentives are gone and the benefits of carbon sequestration on soil water quality over time, What do you think that could look like in terms of objectives?
I think that's part of my point. And in some areas, it's harder to see those benefits than in others. But once, you know, when you're trying to change a system, you're making such radical changes that it's difficult to do without financial assistance. But once that system gets broken, is broken over and is functioning the way it was, I guess, naturally, or closer to a natural system without all the artificial inputs, and still yielding the economic benefits and production to you without all the input costs that came along with that modern system. The cost, the inherent cost goes away once that system's broken over. So it's just the breakover cost is the big thing.
Michael, can I ask a quick clarifying question? So it takes someone, say, 5 years, and I have no idea, to put the system that you're talking about in place with cover crops. And so at that point, you think the incentives could go away because the farmer is recognizing the benefits of that conversion, or do you need to keep them going after the system gets to where you want it?
Depending on the cropping system you have in it, and it's not conducive to all cropping systems that we have, but many and most have it. The systems can work in it, and I think it's been shown that I think we can support 3 to 5 years and walk away, and nationwide, producers nationwide after that initial 3 to 5 years have been maintaining those systems in many cases across the United States. So it's not to say that it's the magic bullet.
No, but
and Naveen has done some work on it, and I'm not sure what trends he's seen. And certainly it's almost impossible for some producers to make those changes without some type of compensatory assistance up front. But I think over the long haul, there can be less need for it once the system starts to break over.
But the incentives are important to get that producer's attention.
Yes, certainly.
And with most, if not all, of the programs provided by NRCS, there are incentives that come with those programs.
So essentially, it would be providing and continuing incentives specific to the crop and time it takes for the conversion into the system you want it. So it's put them up front and then continue them, and that will be a factor of what you're growing and how long it takes to get to that state. And for some crops, you may have to continue it for the life of the crop if you want to see it managed like that. Is that?
I think that's fair to say. Case in point, the difference between, say, raising corn, soybeans, cotton versus something like sugarcane. They're very different crops, different cropping systems across the board. Sugarcane is one of those systems that's very difficult to work the soil health management systems, the full-blown consideration into. Not impossible to get some aspects in, but more difficult than the traditional, cotton, corn, soybean type rotations. So,
thank you.
Yes. And then, just a little side note on that is to look at the different number of acres we have. As I mentioned earlier, we are very diverse in what we do. I don't know, sugarcane, maybe 450,000 acres. Rice, Ernest, what would your guess estimation be on the number of acres we have in rice production?
They've been less than 500.
My point being is that these crops, they're different, and the different kind of practices or programs that you develop to help reduce the emissions that we've been charged with looking at trying to do. That needs to be taken into account. Just how much how much land area are we talking about with what we're trying to do with the different crops that we produce. And then as far as forestry is concerned, Lord, that's the number one. We refer to that as an ag crop as well. That's the number one ag crop in the state. And I don't know, I mean, that's statewide. So you're talking about millions of acres.
That's a great point to make, Ron. And we've talked a lot about the agriculture and forestry side. So I'd like to turn focus more to conservation and waste. So I'll call on Greg from the conservation side. I know that CPRA is working with the Water Institute of the Gulf on a blue carbon project, quantifying blue carbon. So this is something that's very much on your mind and on the mind of CPRA from the conservation side. And then on the waste management, I'd like to call on Yolanda to think through what our objectives should be there as well.
Sure. Lindsay, this is Greg Grandy. We are working with the folks at CPRA to try to get a better idea of where the state of the science is relative to defining those carbon sequestration benefits of projects. And I think a number of folks had mentioned that we need to be able to quantify how well these projects work. And that's part of what we're working with the Water Institute and some others to try to help identify where is the state of the science relative to how do you assign benefits of carbon sequestration to different types of projects, so that as you're establishing a measurable goal for a particular project or a particular program, that you're appropriately measuring, appropriately identifying and quantifying what those benefits would be. And that, I think, is an important distinction. And one of the things, as you're doing structural decision making kind of relative to the larger process, and I think it's great that the governor assigned goals that are measurable to the overall initiative. It's easier to achieve your goals if you know exactly what they are from the outset. So I think that having measurable goals or measurable objectives, I think, is an important part of what it is we're trying to do, and being able to use the best available science in the structured decision-making process to be able to identify not just the benefits, but also the cost of these particular actions that we're discussing. And I'll leave it there, and just want to say I really appreciate the discussion from a diverse group of folks relative to this topic. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. It's a very important piece for us to consider. So Yolanda, on the waste side, what do you think needs to be incorporated into these objectives?
I think a broad objective on the waste side would be to maximize opportunities for waste reduction and reuse, specifically landfill gas emissions, waste to energy initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else on the waste management perspective that should be represented here? And I know agricultural waste is something else that we should consider, and also conservation, not only and carbon sequestration, not only of coastal restoration projects, but also of other agricultural and forestry lands. So any other ideas on incorporating those objectives?
The only other thing, Lindsay, that I would add would be the waste to energy initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm sorry.
What is the waste energy initiative?
Well, it sort of piggybacks off of landfill gas, just capturing the gas. And actually, you know, converting that to energy initiatives.
Mm. And what else were you going to mention, Yolanda?
I think from a waste perspective, that's sort of a general catch-all. And what I will do is reach out to some other folks here at DEQ and then follow up, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm. That would be great.
Lindsay, this is Joey Bro. One thing that I would add to the ag solid waste for an objective there would be to try to increase blending of waste streams so that one producer is not left with a waste that he or she would be willing to beneficially use with no potential beneficial use there. Maybe combining cotton gin trash with something else would be a local benefit to producers, whether as a bulking agent in a part of someone else's composting process or to be incorporated directly into the soil on local cropland. And they could become part of the soil microbial process there, integrated into below ground biomass. And there's a lot of people and a lot of waste generators in the ag realm that want to do this, but just don't have an outlet for their waste stream. And it would be good to be able to connect them somehow.
And Joe, you said that would be for composting?
Well, ag waste. Yes, composting is one of the things, one of the many beneficial uses that through the Ag BMP program we strive for. But it's no different or little different than crop residue management. It's just incorporating ag waste into the soil, creating a mulch, if you will.
And Joey, did you particularly call it blending the stream? Is that how you phrased it? Blending the...
If that works, yes.
And Yolanda, when you mentioned that, was it waste to energy initiative or was it waste management initiative? What?
Waste to energy. Waste to energy.
Waste to energy. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So members, we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like for us to cover next steps and move into our public comments. But I'll note that this,
I'm sorry, I should raise my hand. Could I just add one more bullet to this list? I know we've talked around it and the importance of forests, but maybe a specific bullet to identifying mechanisms for increasing the forest carbon sink. So that could be in encouraging management or markets that would incentivize the management of forests.
That's a great idea.
To that effect, I would just like to add forestry swampland carbon sinks. I think there's a unique component there.
Wonderful. So members, I think this is a great starting point on our fundamental objectives discussion. And I'll note this in our next steps in just a few minutes, but if you think of other objectives as you go throughout the weekend even, please do email them to me. I'll take any additional objectives you guys have through around Tuesday before we start compiling and distilling some of these objectives and creating some succinct bullets. So please feel free to reach out to me and we can continue this discussion. So with that, I just wanted to reframe our discussion in light of the SDM framework. So today we talked about this step 1 and 2. And so as I mentioned behind the scenes, we'll review the notes of all that was said, not just what was written. And next meeting, we'll come back with a finalized list. And in the interim, the co-chairs, Karen and Joey, will present the draft committee charge as well as these fundamental objectives to the task force when they meet next. So at the end of December when they meet. And so we'll use these fundamental objectives to guide us as we move forward along in this process. So let's move on to agenda item number 9 and discuss a few next steps. I wanted to outline for you guys the timeline looking towards our interim report, which is due in February. And I highlighted in red the role of this committee. And as you can see, we have 2 meetings before that interim report. In this first one, we have met to establish our objectives and to have our introductions and understand the process. And in our next meeting, we'll be able to discuss opportunities and challenges and resources and the process for developing solutions. And that will get us a little bit closer to starting to think about these emission reduction strategies. So what that looks like as next steps between now and the next meeting, as I mentioned, please feel free to send more fundamental objectives my way or to our climate@la.gov email by Tuesday would be preferable. These last 2 steps are in reference to a Google Drive that I created, and I'll share with all of our members after the meeting. And I want us to really have a place where we can just dump resources that are relevant to this effort. As we saw and as we talked about, the 2010 inventory is not comprehensive of the scope of what we need to cover in this committee. So I'd like us between now and our next meeting in January to start sharing resources, possibly from efforts you've worked on before or projects you have, maybe expertise or research that you can offer to the table, partnerships that will be important to us, data technology, maybe policies and laws from other states that have done this well. And that will set us on a good track for our next meeting to identify where there are gaps in our knowledge. So what else do we need to know in order to make informed decisions about emission reduction strategies? So I'll send out this drive to you guys and would appreciate if everyone could bring their resources into that.
Lindsay,
so with that, I'll just...
I'm sorry, I just had a process question. So is there any way to get the list of what was on the whiteboard to the committee members, kind of give them food for thought? And maybe it's not even a new objective, maybe it's a slight refinement if you think it needs to be clearer. Lindsay, you did a great job of capturing all those thoughts, may I add. And I know Fran had, for an example, one correction to this one thing. So I think it would be helpful for everybody to just see what's there, and that might spur some feedback by next Tuesday on the 8th.
That's a great idea. I'll send out this presentation with that annotated slide so that everyone can look through what we discussed. As I noted at the beginning, this meeting is also live streamed on YouTube. So if you, for some reason, have 2 spare hours this weekend and want to rewatch this, feel free to.
Great.
So with that, I'll turn it over to our co-chairs and see if they have any next steps that they would like to offer for this group before we move into public comment.
Lindsay, this is Joey. I think you covered it fairly well. I have nothing to add.
I don't either. Thank you, Lindsay.
So as I mentioned, we'll move into public comment period now. So we'll take a break just for a minute or 2 to allow those emails to come in, and then my colleague Charles Sutcliffe will read the public comments into the record for us. And we'll accept these via our email, climate@la.gov. And if you aren't able to produce this comment in the timeline, please still email us at that address. We check it frequently and, again, want the public to be very engaged in this process. So with that, let's break until 12:01 and then come back with public comment.
Thank you. Lindsay, I just noted that we have a reference to the Transportation Committee, but we know it's for the ag. We need to probably come up with some initials so people don't have to type that whole time.
So let's enter into agenda item 10, and I'll turn it over to Charles.
Yeah, thanks everybody on the committee. I just have one public comment that came in for our group. And it says, this is from Angel Bradford with the Sierra Club. She says she appreciates this committee is happening. The conversation that will or should take place among this group are critical, or crucial, and intersectional in many ways. But she implores whoever is scheduling these meetings, however, to clarify what the public is supposed to be commenting on. There's no content to review nor item to speak on. We're just expected to throw ideas out there. She's just looking for clarity there. And B, she would like to see public health data and toxins as additional layers for how we both address climate change and environmental destruction, in addition to reducing carbon emissions. Reducing carbon while increasing methane is of no use, for example. Finally, the last minute nature of these meetings is just not acceptable. Folks are working. These meetings should be in the evening, not the day, and we need 1 to 2 weeks notice minimum. And that's the only one we've received today.
I appreciate that feedback. Thank you.
And I'll note that that's a great idea to include public health data. And we do very much listen to the public comments in consideration of our objectives. So we encourage people to make comments that we will consider in our objectives as well, because that is very important to us.
Lindsay, one more comment did just come in. This is from Stephen Poss. It says, I missed a great deal of the meeting, but I did like most of what you were planning. However, if David Dismukes has any input, it should be taken with a block of salt. He's been a shill for the fossil fuel industry as far back as I can remember. So that's just a verbatim comment there from the public.
Thanks, Charles. With that, we can move to agenda item 11. Karen and Joey.
All right, I need to scroll down for 11.
Item number 7. Folks, we're near adjournment, it seems, and this is a lot of great input. I mean, Melissa, John, and Mike, we also look forward to your input in the science advisory portion of this, and I think there's a lot of great work to come. We're a little bit over, not too much. I think Lindsay put together a great program and kept this knucklehead in line for the most part. I can't express enough gratitude and thanks for all of you that have agreed to be part of this. I think there's a lot of good work to come. Like Naveen said, my earliest precaution was that this timeline is beyond ambitious, but we can only do our best, and we're going to, and we've got all the right people in place to do it. So I think we're going to come up with something really great. Again, thanks, everybody. Hope you all have a great weekend. And Lindsay and Charles, thanks for all you do in keeping this running and keeping it together. And that's all I've got, y'all.
Yeah, and I'll just add briefly, I learned quite a bit and appreciate all the members of the group, the staff that made this happen. I appreciate the public input we received. And I really do encourage, since we are on such a compressed timeline, to be thinking about the information you'd like to share. And when Lindsay puts that link up, please utilize it. And I also encourage conversations, not meeting quorum, obviously, but if we have questions or would like to see a refinement, reach out and contact a committee member and say, I'd be interested in learning more about this. So we can have that exchange of information as well as putting it on the box that Lindsay provides. But thank all of you very much. good meeting.
Do any committee members have any additional comments before we adjourn?
And we will get an email list of the group contact information, correct?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Great job, you all.
All right, if
Indeed,
no one
thank
has
you.
any additional comments, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Second.
Second.
All right, thank y'all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.